Pastor Elijah Moore was a central figure in the small but lively community of Greater Hope Baptist Church in Atlanta. For years, he had led the congregation with sermons that drew from a mix of heartfelt wisdom and clear conviction. Known for his thoughtful approach, he fostered an environment of warmth where trust and mutual respect thrived. Every Sunday, members of the congregation looked forward to his presence at the pulpit. His deep voice carried through the sanctuary, and his sermons were a blend of powerful rhetoric and gentle guidance, leaving a lasting impact on the people who filled the pews. His wife, Angela, stood by his side through every step of his journey in ministry. Angela was admired for her poise and unwavering support of her husband, known to all as the soft-spoken yet resilient First Lady of Greater Hope. She managed church events, attended to new members, and was an emotional pillar for Elijah. Their family, completed by their teenage son Jordan, was seen as a model of stability and faith within the congregation. Jordan was a quiet teenager, wrestling with his own spiritual questions, but still proud of his father's role. While he occasionally felt the pressure of his father's high expectations, he respected the importance of their family's position within the church. Greater Hope was more than a place of worship, it was a community that shaped his identity. For the congregation, Pastor Moore was not just a spiritual leader but a mentor who took the time to connect personally with his members, often meeting with them individually. He would hold regular sessions for young adults in the congregation, focusing on life's challenges, moral questions, and the importance of resilience. One evening after a Bible study, a young woman, Faith Turner, approached him, and this conversation marked the beginning of an unusual bond. Faith, a 20-something woman with a troubled past, had recently returned to the church, seeking a renewed connection with her faith. Faith had been away from church for years, having drifted from the congregation during a difficult period in her life. Pastor Elijah knew about her history. He was aware of the hardships she had endured, the periods of absence, and the struggles she faced on her return. He saw potential in her that perhaps she couldn't yet see in herself. Elijah believed that with the right guidance, Faith could regain a sense of purpose. Angela initially felt a quiet sense of pride seeing her husband offer so much of himself to someone in need. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, Faith became a frequent visitor to the church office, seeking counsel at hours that began to feel too frequent and too personal. Angela began to notice Faith's almost eager presence in their church gatherings, her fixed attention on Elijah's every word, and her tendency to linger in conversations after everyone else had left. Meanwhile, the congregation started whispering about Faith's sudden devotion and her visible presence around Pastor Elijah. It wasn't out of jealousy or malice, but curiosity. Elijah had mentored others in the congregation before, but something about his time with Faith appeared different. Some members confided in Angela, expressing mild concern, though she downplayed the notion, dismissing it as simple gossip. As Elijah continued mentoring Faith, he shared his belief with Angela that Faith's reformation was a testament to the power of forgiveness and spiritual renewal. He described Faith as a lost soul in search of redemption, reminding his wife that every member deserved a second chance. However, Angela could not ignore the uneasy feeling that had begun to settle within her. As the weeks progressed, Faith's connection to Pastor Elijah deepened. She began to confide in him not only about her struggles with faith, but also about personal troubles she had long kept hidden. Pastor Elijah, seeing in her a lost soul in need of guidance, felt a renewed sense of purpose in his mentorship. Their meetings moved from casual discussions after Bible study to scheduled, private sessions in his office. Elijah believed he was helping Faith rebuild her life, offering her counsel and direction that he hoped would lead her back to stability. Faith was, for her part, deeply moved by the attention Elijah showed her. She opened up about her past hardships, revealing struggles with family and periods of isolation. She spoke of a feeling of emptiness and the darkness she had felt in her soul before returning to church. Each session seemed to lift a weight from her, and she looked forward to these moments with an almost unspoken anticipation. Elijah, ever the patient listener, offered words of encouragement, quoting scripture and sharing personal anecdotes to demonstrate resilience and strength. As their sessions continued, Elijah became more invested in Faith's journey. He often took time to research scripture or reflect on his own experiences that might help Faith navigate her current struggles. He rationalized the extra time he spent with her as part of his role in the church, fulfilling his calling to guide those who had lost their way. However, his attention to Faith began to subtly affect other aspects of his life. Meetings ran late, and he sometimes arrived home after dinner, his mind still lingering on conversations they had shared. Angela, who was accustomed to the long hours her husband dedicated to his ministry, initially thought little of the time Elijah spent counseling Faith. But over time, she noticed subtle changes in him. He would speak of Faith often, referring to her with a sense of pride and protectiveness. His conversations about her grew more frequent, and Angela began to feel that her husband's commitment to Faith might be crossing into more personal territory. One evening, after Elijah returned home late from a counseling session, Angela quietly expressed her concern. "Elijah, I know you care about Faith, but do you think perhaps it's becoming too much?" she asked, her tone measured but curious. Elijah waved off her worries with a dismissive smile. "Angela, she's been through so much. She needs guidance, someone to lean on." "This is what I'm here for," he replied confidently. "Faith has no one else." But Angela couldn't shake her unease. As a trusted presence in the congregation, she began to notice the subtle, sideways glances from church members and the quiet exchanges that stopped when she walked by. Though they were merely whispers, she sensed a pattern forming, an air of doubt settling around Elijah's reputation. Members seemed to question the growing closeness between their pastor and Faith, and some even subtly hinted at their discomfort to Angela. Meanwhile, Elijah remained unaware of the effect his relationship with Faith was having on his wife and the church community. He continued to meet with Faith regularly, urging her to share openly, confident that he was helping her build a more stable foundation. As their sessions stretched longer, he was unaware of the impression his actions left on those around him. To him, his meetings with Faith were nothing more than a mission to save a soul in distress. As the church whispers grew louder, Angela's suspicions deepened. She worried that Elijah's devotion to Faith, though well-intentioned, could harm their family and his reputation. Determined to protect both, she confronted him more directly one evening, her tone firmer. "Elijah, I understand the need to help her, but I don't want you to lose sight of what's important here. Our family. Your role in this church. People are talking, and it could cause more harm than you realize," Angela stated, her words layered with concern. Again, Elijah brushed her fears aside, his conviction unshaken. "Angela, this is my duty. I cannot ignore someone in need because of idle gossip. Faith is like any other member of this church, and I am simply offering her support. That's all." Angela fell silent, her heart heavy with doubt. While Elijah remained steadfast in his belief that he was fulfilling his pastoral obligations, Angela could feel a divide forming, an invisible boundary that his relationship with Faith had quietly drawn between them. The once clear line between faith and friendship had begun to blur, and with it, the peace within their home and community. As the quiet unease in the Moore household began to deepen, Angela found herself wrestling with feelings that had been building for weeks. Elijah's attention to Faith, initially a point of pride for her, had started to feel like an intrusion. The space that Faith occupied in her husband's life grew too large, creating shadows over the family. Angela noticed how Elijah would often drift away in thought during dinner, his gaze distant. Though he was physically present, his mind seemed elsewhere, weighed down by a concern she no longer felt privy to. The gradual erosion of trust took root, creating a silence that hung heavily in their once harmonious home. Faith, on the other hand, was uncomfortably aware of Angela's shifting demeanor. The warmth she once felt from the pastor's wife had cooled, replaced by a polite restraint that Faith sensed immediately. Though Elijah's guidance had brought her clarity and a sense of purpose, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider intruding on his life, particularly when she observed Angela's quiet glances or the unspoken tension in the room. Faith's appreciation for the pastor's support was genuine, but she was beginning to feel as if she were walking a line that might crack beneath her feet at any moment. Jordan, Elijah's teenage son, was not oblivious to the changes in his parents' relationship. Recently, he had been struggling with his own questions about faith and felt distanced from his father, who seemed to give so much of himself to others, especially Faith. Jordan viewed Faith's arrival in their lives as a direct cause of his parents' tension and resented her presence. She had disrupted the stability he once felt within his family, and it fueled the determination within him to confront her, to expose what he felt was a hidden agenda. The atmosphere in the Moore household became increasingly strained, and the church community began to sense it as well. As whispers circulated about Elijah's involvement with Faith, Jordan's resentment simmered, prompting him to take matters into his own hands. He watched for moments when Faith was alone at the church or in the community, following her movements and observing her interactions with his father from afar. His intention was to uncover proof of the damage he felt she had brought upon his family. One evening, as Faith was gathering supplies at the church after an evening meeting, Jordan approached her. His usual friendly demeanor was absent, replaced by a tense resolve. Faith sensed his hostility, noticing the way his eyes, which so often reflected his father's warmth, now glared at her with an accusing intensity. Without preamble, Jordan demanded to know the nature of her relationship with his father, his voice barely controlled. His words hinted at suspicion, accusations unspoken but clearly implied. Faith, caught off guard, stammered out a response, insisting that her interactions with Pastor Elijah were purely pastoral. She felt her cheeks flush under Jordan's piercing gaze, and for a moment, her own uncertainty surfaced. Was her relationship with Pastor Elijah crossing a line, even if unintentionally? Jordan's accusation forced her to confront an uncomfortable question, one she had tried to avoid. In her heart, she had always regarded Pastor Elijah as a mentor, someone who had helped her in a difficult time, but now doubt lingered. Jordan, unsatisfied with her explanations, stormed off, leaving Faith shaken. His words echoed in her mind, a lingering reminder of the discomfort she had tried to suppress. The tension that had grown between her, Elijah, and his family now felt like an insurmountable barrier, a wall that seemed to grow higher with every passing day. As the night fell and the church remained silent, Faith's sense of isolation intensified. She realized that her presence in Elijah's life had become a point of contention, casting ripples of discord that had spread beyond their private sessions. The events of that evening left her questioning her place within the church community and whether her presence was doing more harm than good. Unbeknownst to them all, this hidden jealousy, simmering in the shadows, would soon lead to confrontations with consequences that none of them could foresee. In the Moore's once stable world, the foundation of trust was crumbling, fractured by suspicions and misunderstandings, and a quiet storm was beginning to brew, one that would soon shatter the lives intertwined in this growing tension. In his search for answers, Jordan dug deeper into Faith's past, piecing together details from whispered conversations and fragments of old stories he'd overheard around town. His investigation took on a life of its own, driven by a mix of frustration and anger. He visited parts of town he had never been to before, asking subtle questions about Faith and her life before she joined the church community. Eventually, Jordan stumbled upon something that shocked him, a record that pointed to a troubling chapter in Faith's life, one that hinted at a history of betrayal and broken relationships. The details were vague, but the implications were clear. Faith's past was far more complicated than anyone in the congregation knew, and her involvement with his father now appeared suspiciously calculated. This revelation weighed heavily on Jordan. Although he lacked a complete picture, he began to believe that Faith might be manipulating his father under the guise of seeking mentorship and guidance. Fueled by his discovery, he became determined to expose her, convinced that doing so would protect his family from any further harm. Meanwhile, Angela's suspicions about her husband's relationship with Faith were mounting. The tension in her household had become nearly unbearable, with conversations between her and Elijah growing brief and strained. She had tried to confront Elijah directly, but he dismissed her concerns, insisting that his connection to Faith was nothing more than pastoral care. However, Angela sensed something much deeper was at play, and the secrecy around it unsettled her. Knowing she could no longer sit by passively, she decided to confront Faith herself, hoping for answers. Angela arranged to meet Faith at the church on a quiet weekday afternoon. The sanctuary was empty, its familiar walls lined with shadows as light filtered in through the stained glass windows, casting a somber atmosphere over their meeting. When Faith arrived, Angela could see the apprehension in her eyes. She was nervous, possibly aware of the unspoken tension between them. Angela wasted no time and addressed Faith directly, demanding to know the nature of her relationship with Elijah and what exactly she wanted from him. Faith, feeling cornered and vulnerable, took a deep breath before she began to explain her past, a past she had kept hidden from nearly everyone in the church. She revealed that she had come from a history marked by difficult relationships and painful betrayals, circumstances that had led her to seek solace within the church. Her decision to confide in Pastor Elijah was born out of a desperate need for support. Faith admitted that she trusted Elijah because he had been the first person to listen without judgment, offering her the guidance she so badly needed during her lowest moments. As Faith spoke, her voice softened, and Angela saw the raw vulnerability behind her words. For a moment, Angela's anger dissipated, replaced by an uneasy sympathy. She began to understand that Faith's attachment to Elijah might have been rooted in a need for comfort rather than deceit. Yet the reality of Elijah's emotional investment in Faith troubled her deeply. She realized that, whether intentionally or not, Faith had crossed a line that had damaged Angela's marriage. She felt the weight of societal expectations and the pressure to maintain her family's image within the church, and the strain of this realization settled heavily upon her. Angela left the meeting with more questions than answers, her mind clouded by the implications of Faith's past and her own deep-seated fears for her marriage. She now faced the challenge of reconciling her understanding of her husband's pastoral duties with the emotional toll it had taken on their personal lives. The conversation with Faith lingered in her thoughts, illuminating the hidden fractures in her relationship with Elijah that had slowly been widening over time. Meanwhile, Jordan's discovery weighed heavily on him, amplifying his resentment toward Faith. He sensed that the stakes were rising, that this growing rift within his family could soon lead to irreparable consequences. Little did they all know, this sinister revelation was just the beginning, and the choices they each made in the days to come would bring about a tragic series of events that none of them could foresee. In the days leading up to the final confrontation, whispers within the church community had reached a fever pitch. Congregants had grown increasingly suspicious of the time Pastor Elijah spent with Faith. What once seemed like a display of pastoral compassion now raised brows and sparked hushed conversations. One particular church member, known for his watchful eye and willingness to speak candidly, confronted Elijah after a sermon, openly questioning the appropriateness of his relationship with Faith. This public challenge, witnessed by several members, ignited a tension that could no longer be contained. Angela, already tormented by months of suspicion and the emotional strain it had placed on her marriage, was there when the question was raised. She looked at Elijah, her face a mixture of pain and expectation, as if waiting for him to either refute the accusation with strength or acknowledge the emotional bond he'd formed with Faith. But Elijah's face betrayed him, a flicker of hesitation that only deepened Angela's fears. Faith, who had been nearby, saw the unfolding confrontation and sensed the gravity of the accusations. She approached, attempting to calm the situation, yet her presence only intensified the emotions. Angela's voice, usually measured and steady, grew louder, fueled by months of pent-up frustration. She accused Faith of driving a wedge into her marriage and questioned Elijah's loyalty to their vows and their family. As Angela's anger spilled over, the sanctuary echoed with the intensity of her words. The hallowed space, meant for peace and reflection, had become the setting for a painfully public reckoning. Elijah tried to defuse the situation, pleading with Angela to calm down, but his own guilt rendered his words hollow. His attempts to restore order only stoked the flames, especially as Jordan, who had been watching from a distance, saw his mother's dignity hanging in the balance. Fueled by resentment and the revelations he had uncovered about Faith, Jordan could no longer hold back. He stormed toward Faith, his protective instincts overpowering any sense of caution. Words erupted, sharp and cutting, as he accused her of disrupting his family and tainting his father's role as a trusted pastor. Faith tried to defend herself, but Jordan's anger was overwhelming, his accusations brutal. In the heat of the moment, Faith took a step back, her face a mixture of hurt and defiance. But as Jordan moved closer, his emotions overpowering his control, his hand pushed her shoulder in an impulsive, anger-fueled gesture. In the sudden rush of movement, Faith lost her balance. There was a moment of suspended silence as she fell backward, striking her head against a pew before collapsing onto the sanctuary floor. The impact echoed throughout the sanctuary, breaking the stillness and bringing everyone to a halt. Angela gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, frozen in shock. Elijah's face drained of color as he rushed to Faith's side, but it was clear that she was no longer breathing. The reality of what had just happened settled over the room like a dark, unyielding weight. As the first church members approached the scene, horror and disbelief rippled through the crowd. No one had intended for things to escalate to this level, yet they were now faced with the tragic outcome of unchecked emotions and the consequences of jealousy, mistrust, and betrayal. The Moore's life, once a model of faith and family unity, had shattered in a matter of moments. The congregation was left grappling with the aftermath, shocked by the sight of Faith lying lifeless in the very place she had sought refuge. For the Moore family, the devastation was twofold. They faced the loss of faith, the betrayal of the church community, and the knowledge that their once solid foundation had crumbled under the weight of hidden emotions and forbidden attachments. In the days that followed, the church's members remained in a state of shock, their community forever altered. The once unquestioned trust in their pastor was broken, and whispers of blame and guilt floated through the town. The tragic consequences of hidden desires and miscommunication had left an indelible mark on everyone involved, a haunting reminder of the fragile line between love, loyalty, and ruin. Reverend Charles Monroe's life was one that many admired. In New Orleans, he had built a reputation as a pillar of the community. His sermons were powerful yet comforting, emphasizing themes of redemption and the enduring strength of faith. Members of his congregation often sought his guidance, believing him to be a man of unshakable morals and wisdom. At home, he seemed equally steadfast, a loving husband to his wife, Evelyn, and a doting father to their grown son, Marcus. But beneath the surface, Charles's world was beginning to fracture. For years, Charles had maintained a strict routine. Mornings were spent in quiet prayer, afternoons in counseling sessions with parishioners, and evenings in his study preparing sermons. Evelyn knew her husband as a man of discipline and devotion, always quick to offer a smile or comforting word. But recently, those small gestures had vanished. His demeanor grew tense and guarded, his once bright eyes clouded with worry. Evelyn first noticed a change in Charles during dinner one evening. He had been unusually quiet, picking at his food and barely engaging in conversation. When she asked if something was troubling him, he brushed her off with a forced smile. But the signs of strain became harder to ignore. He spent hours pacing in his study, his footsteps echoing through the house late into the night. On more than one occasion, Evelyn caught him staring out the window, his expression a mix of fear and deep contemplation. Even his behavior at church began to shift. Charles, who had always delivered impassioned sermons, now seemed distant, his words lacking their usual conviction. Congregants whispered about the pastor's apparent exhaustion, noting his absence from key meetings and community events. Evelyn heard the murmurs but chose to ignore them, convinced that her husband's troubles were temporary. Eventually, Evelyn confronted Charles directly, unable to bear his silence any longer. He hesitated, his hands trembling as he finally confessed that the church's treasury had been stolen. The funds, meant to support various community programs and maintain the church itself, were gone without a trace. Charles admitted that he feared being accused of stealing the money for personal use. The thought of tarnishing his reputation and losing the trust of his congregation consumed him with dread. Evelyn, ever supportive, acted quickly to ease his burden. She reached out to her sister, who had always been generous in times of need, and borrowed a significant sum to replace the missing funds. With the money in hand, Charles was able to reassure the church's board that the financial discrepancy had been resolved. For a brief period, it seemed as though the crisis had been averted. Charles appeared to return to his old self, smiling more often and engaging with his family and congregation again. Evelyn felt a sense of relief, believing that her husband had overcome the worst of his troubles. She admired his resilience and was glad she could help him through what she assumed was an isolated incident. But the reprieve was short-lived. Within weeks, Charles began to retreat into himself once more. He avoided eye contact with Evelyn and spent hours locked in his study, emerging only to give sermons that felt hollow and uninspired. His sleep became erratic, plagued by nightmares that left him visibly shaken in the mornings. Evelyn's attempts to comfort him were met with vague reassurances or silence. Evelyn's concern deepened as she watched the man she had loved for decades become a shadow of himself. She tried to piece together what might have triggered his relapse, but found no clear answers. The mystery weighed heavily on her, leaving her feeling helpless and increasingly anxious. Evelyn Monroe's phone buzzed late one evening, pulling her from her restless thoughts. She had spent the day worrying about Charles, his erratic behavior weighing heavily on her mind. At first, she ignored the notification, thinking it might be an automated alert or an inconsequential message. But something compelled her to check. What she saw made her blood run cold. The message was anonymous, with no sender information visible. Attached was a video file and a single line of text: "Your husband has stopped answering my calls. Tell him if he doesn't pay up, I'll release the full video." Hesitant yet unable to resist, Evelyn tapped on the video. The grainy footage was unmistakable. It showed Charles in an intimate encounter with another man, the scene undeniably damning. Evelyn's hands shook as she processed what she had just seen. Her stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The betrayal she felt was profound. For over 30 years, she had stood by Charles, trusting him as a loyal husband and a man of faith. Now, that trust lay in pieces, shattered by the stark reality playing out on her phone screen. As the initial wave of shock subsided, Evelyn's emotions swirled into a chaotic storm. Anger and heartbreak competed with confusion and a growing sense of dread. But beneath the raw pain, Evelyn recognized the deeper implication of the message. Charles wasn't just unfaithful, he was being blackmailed. Whoever had sent the video knew her husband's position in the community and intended to exploit it. Evelyn sat frozen, the phone still in her hand, replaying the message in her mind. The line "he doesn't pay up" stood out, confirming her suspicions about the church treasury theft. Her mind began connecting the dots. The missing funds, Charles's increasing anxiety, and now this, it all fit together. This wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a public scandal waiting to erupt. Steeling herself, Evelyn confronted Charles that same night. She found him in his study, staring blankly at a closed Bible on his desk. The moment she walked in, he knew something was wrong. When she showed him the video, his face paled, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of the revelation. For a moment, there was only silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Charles broke down, the tears flowing freely as he began to confess. He admitted that he had struggled with feelings for men for years, feelings he had buried beneath layers of faith and duty. He had convinced himself that those desires were sinful temptations to be resisted, but recently, the burden of repression had become too much. One impulsive decision had led him to a brothel, where, for the first time, he acted on those feelings. Charles explained that he had been unaware of the hidden cameras recording the encounter. It wasn't until weeks later that the threats began. The owners of the brothel had recognized him and realized the value of the footage. They demanded monthly payments in exchange for their silence, threatening to ruin his reputation and expose his secrets if he refused. Desperate and terrified, Charles had stolen from the church treasury to make the first payment. He knew it was wrong, but the fear of losing everything, his family, his congregation, and his standing in the community, had clouded his judgment. The shame of his actions, combined with the ongoing extortion, had driven him to the brink. Evelyn listened, her heart breaking anew with every word. She saw the depth of Charles's remorse, his anguish over the harm he had caused. Yet, her own pain was equally profound. The man she thought she knew had hidden so much from her, and now she was left to grapple with the fallout of his choices. As Charles continued to sob, Evelyn wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to lash out, to demand answers to questions she wasn't even sure how to ask. But another part recognized that anger wouldn't solve their problems. They were in this together, whether she liked it or not, and she knew they needed a plan to confront the blackmailers and protect what remained of their lives. Evelyn Monroe's mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening to her husband. Charles's confession and the blackmail plot had left her shaken, but her determination to find a solution was unwavering. She suggested hiring a private investigator, someone discreet and experienced who could uncover the identities of the blackmailers and neutralize their threats. Evelyn believed that exposing their operation would not only protect Charles but also end the cycle of fear that had consumed their lives. But Charles refused. His rejection was immediate and absolute. He argued that involving anyone else, especially a professional, would only spread the scandal further. The thought of others discovering his secret, his congregation, his colleagues, even his son, was too much for him to bear. He vowed to resolve the situation himself, claiming it was the only way to protect their family and his reputation. Despite Evelyn's protests, Charles remained adamant. She watched him retreat into his study, his hands trembling as he leafed through papers, his mind clearly racing. That night, he barely spoke to her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his insistence on handling things alone would only lead to disaster. The following morning, Charles left the house earlier than usual. He didn't mention where he was going, nor did he leave a note. Evelyn assumed he was heading to the church, but as the hours passed without a word from him, her anxiety deepened. She called his phone multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn's unease turned to panic. Something felt terribly wrong. She replayed his parting words from the previous night, his vague assurances that he would take care of everything, and realized how final they had sounded. Her intuition screamed that Charles was in trouble, and she needed help before it was too late. With no other options, Evelyn contacted the police. She explained the situation, carefully choosing her words to protect Charles's reputation while conveying the urgency of her fears. She detailed the blackmail scheme, the emotional toll it had taken on her husband, and her growing belief that he was planning something drastic. The authorities took Evelyn's concerns seriously. They began tracing Charles's movements, pulling traffic camera footage and using cell phone tower data to determine his location. The search led them to a notorious brothel on the outskirts of New Orleans, a place with a history of illicit activity and a reputation for catering to powerful clients. Officers were immediately dispatched to the address. Evelyn waited anxiously for updates, her heart pounding with every passing second. She prayed that the police would reach Charles in time, that whatever he was planning could be stopped before it spiraled out of control. The brothel, hidden behind an unassuming facade in the outskirts of New Orleans, was a sight of unimaginable horror when the police arrived. The building was eerily quiet, the heavy scent of gunpowder and blood lingering in the stale air. Officers moved cautiously through the dimly lit hallways, their boots leaving faint impressions in the pools of blood that stained the floor. Every corner of the brothel bore the marks of violence, from overturned furniture to bullet holes riddling the walls. In one of the inner rooms, they found Charles Monroe. He was slumped in the corner, his back against the wall and his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His once clear eyes were wide and unfocused, staring blankly at the devastation around him. A pistol lay discarded on the floor nearby, its barrel still warm. Charles's clothes were soaked with blood, though most of it wasn't his own. His lips moved faintly, whispering fragments of prayers or apologies that no one could decipher. The bodies of 8 adults, 5 men and 3 women, were strewn across the brothel's various rooms. Investigators quickly noted that the victims ranged from brothel workers to clients. It was a chaotic scene, with no clear distinction as to who had been targeted. The wounds on the victims were brutal, many struck multiple times, as if Charles had acted with unrelenting fury. The walls bore the splatter patterns of close-range gunfire, and the floor was littered with shell casings. Piecing together the sequence of events, investigators surmised that Charles had entered the brothel with a singular purpose: to confront the owners about the blackmail. Witnesses later testified that he had demanded the destruction of the video and an end to the extortion. When his demands were refused, something inside him snapped. Overwhelmed by fear, shame, and anger, Charles had drawn his weapon and opened fire. The initial shots appeared to have been aimed at the owners of the brothel. Their bodies were found in an office near the back, slumped over desks that still held incriminating evidence of their illegal operations. But Charles hadn't stopped there. In his rage, he had turned his weapon on anyone who crossed his path, unable, or unwilling, to differentiate between those complicit in the blackmail and those who were merely bystanders. When the shooting stopped, the once respected pastor was left alone in the silence, surrounded by the consequences of his actions. The weapon fell from his hand, and he sank to the floor, his mind fracturing under the weight of what he had done. Hours later, when the police burst through the doors, they found him in the same position, his whispered prayers barely audible above the officer's commands. Charles offered no resistance as he was arrested. His body was limp as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, and he did not protest as he was led out of the brothel. He was a shadow of the man he had once been, consumed by guilt and despair. The officers noted his muttered phrases, fragments of apologies to those he had killed, and pleas for divine forgiveness. The investigators continued their grim task, documenting the crime scene in painstaking detail. Every bloodstain, bullet hole, and body placement told a story of rage and desperation. The brothel's seedy underbelly was laid bare, with evidence of its blackmail operations uncovered alongside the human toll of Charles's rampage. The massacre left an indelible scar on New Orleans. The revelation of Reverend Charles Monroe's double life and the horrific violence he committed shocked both his congregation and the wider community. News outlets ran relentless coverage of the events, dissecting every detail of his fall from grace. The man who had once been a symbol of hope and morality was now a central figure in one of the most heinous crimes the city had witnessed. Charles faced a barrage of charges, including 8 counts of first-degree murder. His defense team crafted a narrative of desperation and psychological torment, arguing that years of internalized shame and the extortion scheme had pushed him into a temporary state of insanity. They presented testimony from psychologists who described the immense pressure he had endured. The defense painted him as a man caught in an unrelenting storm of guilt, fear, and self-loathing, who snapped under the weight of it all. The prosecution, however, focused on the calculated nature of the crime. They emphasized the cold reality of 8 lives brutally taken and argued that regardless of his emotional state, Charles had entered the brothel with a loaded weapon and a clear intent to kill. They pointed to the indiscriminate nature of the violence, highlighting that not all the victims were complicit in the blackmail. For the jury, this was not just an act of desperation, it was a premeditated act of vengeance. Evelyn Monroe found herself at the center of the media frenzy. The quiet life she had once shared with Charles was replaced by invasive questions, flashing cameras, and relentless scrutiny. She was torn between her love for the man she had shared decades with and the horror of what he had done. Evelyn chose to stand by Charles during the trial, not to excuse his actions but to provide context. She testified about the blackmail and the emotional deterioration she had witnessed in her husband, pleading for leniency and explaining that he had acted out of fear and despair. Despite her testimony and the defense's arguments, the jury was unanimous in their verdict. Charles was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the community that had once revered him was left to grapple with the aftermath. The impact on the church was immediate and devastating. Congregants abandoned the once thriving institution, unable to reconcile their faith with the actions of their spiritual leader. The building itself, once filled with the sound of hymns and prayers, became a haunting reminder of betrayal and loss. Eventually, the church closed its doors, its congregation scattering to other places of worship. For Evelyn, the weight of her husband's crimes became unbearable. The home they had shared for decades felt suffocating, its walls filled with memories tainted by the tragedy. Unable to stay in New Orleans, she moved to a neighboring state, seeking a fresh start. Evelyn found solace in using her story to advocate for mental health awareness, speaking at events and sharing her experiences to help others recognize the importance of seeking help before desperation leads to destruction. Charles, now confined to a prison cell, spent his days in solitude. The once charismatic pastor was a shadow of his former self, consumed by remorse and haunted by the lives he had taken. He devoted himself to prayer, seeking forgiveness from a higher power for the irreversible damage he had caused. Yet, even in his moments of reflection, the weight of his actions remained inescapable. The tragedy of Charles Monroe became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destructive power of secrets, shame, and unchecked desperation. It was a story that resonated deeply within the community, highlighting the fragility of the human spirit when confronted with overwhelming pressure. Charles's name, once associated with sermons of redemption and hope, was now a somber warning of how easily a life built on faith and trust could crumble under the weight of hidden truths. Pastor James Wilkes was a man whose life appeared to be the epitome of success and righteousness. At 62, he had spent decades building his reputation as a spiritual leader and a community cornerstone. His church stood as a symbol of power and prestige, attracting congregants from all walks of life. Behind the pulpit, his sermons were eloquent and impassioned, earning him the unwavering loyalty of his flock. Beyond the church, James wielded influence like a finely honed blade. He owned stakes in local businesses, his financial ventures subtly intertwined with the lives of those around him. His connections with influential figures, politicians, law enforcement, and business leaders ensured that his status was unassailable. Despite his public image, James carried a weighty loneliness. His life of leadership, wealth, and respect left no room for vulnerability or genuine companionship. He had learned to bury his desires, convincing himself that his position demanded it. But beneath the polished surface, James yearned for someone to fill the void in his life, someone who could see past the grandeur and touch the man beneath. The catalyst came one Sunday morning during a service. Among the congregation sat Daniel, a young man in his early 20s with a quiet presence that stood out against the crowd. Daniel's demeanor was unassuming yet magnetic, his downcast eyes and shy smile hinted at humility, while his attentive posture suggested a sincerity rare in others his age. He attended the service with his girlfriend, Lila, who seemed to be his opposite, outgoing, talkative, and quick to engage with those around her. James noticed them immediately, his gaze lingering on Daniel longer than he intended. As weeks passed, Daniel became a regular attendee at the church. James found himself drawn to the young man's presence, noting the way he participated in the service with genuine intent. Daniel's modesty and warmth stirred something dormant in James, a feeling that was both exhilarating and unsettling. He began orchestrating opportunities to interact with Daniel, subtly positioning himself as a mentor. Under the guise of nurturing the younger man's spiritual growth, James invited Daniel to join him in the church's outreach programs, organizing food drives and assisting with community events. Daniel accepted these invitations with a mix of gratitude and deference. He admired the pastor's wisdom and dedication, unaware of the undercurrent of personal interest driving James's actions. James, for his part, became increasingly bold in his pursuit of closeness. He ensured that Daniel's contributions were recognized, lavishing him with praise in front of others. He also offered small gestures of kindness, covering a utility bill for Daniel's struggling family, arranging a job interview for a friend, or providing funds for Lila's educational aspirations. These acts cemented James's role as a benefactor in Daniel's life. Yet, James could not escape the tension brewing within him. His attraction to Daniel was growing more intense, pushing against the boundaries of propriety. In private moments, he questioned his motives, struggling to reconcile his feelings with his role as a pastor. He rationalized his actions as acts of kindness and mentorship, but deep down, he knew his intentions were far from pure. The internal conflict gnawed at him, fueling his determination to win Daniel's affection while maintaining the illusion of selflessness. James's efforts to deepen their connection were not lost on Lila. She began to notice the pastor's disproportionate interest in Daniel, though she could not articulate why it bothered her. She dismissed her unease as jealousy, telling herself that James's attention was merely a reflection of Daniel's worth. Daniel himself remained oblivious, viewing James's generosity as an extension of the pastor's role as a leader and caregiver. In his private quarters, James wrestled with his growing obsession. He found himself replaying conversations with Daniel in his mind, lingering on moments of shared laughter or fleeting touches. The young man's voice, his smile, and even his vulnerabilities became etched into James's thoughts. For the first time in years, James felt alive, but the cost of this awakening was the erosion of his self-control. He began to imagine a future where Daniel was by his side, a partner in his personal life as much as in his spiritual mission. This fantasy, however, came with a significant obstacle: Lila. James recognized that her presence in Daniel's life was an impediment to his desires. Her unwavering support and affection for Daniel reinforced the young man's loyalty to her, creating a barrier James could not easily overcome. As the weeks turned into months, James's thoughts turned darker. He began contemplating ways to remove Lila from the equation, rationalizing his intentions as a necessary step toward his own happiness and Daniel's liberation. Unbeknownst to Daniel or Lila, James had set his sights on a dangerous course. The seeds of his plan were taking root, and the pastor who had spent a lifetime guiding others toward salvation was preparing to step into the shadows of sin and deception. Daniel had initially been flattered by Pastor James's attention. As someone who had grown up in modest circumstances, struggling to support his family and navigate the challenges of young adulthood, Daniel saw James as a mentor and a source of stability. The pastor's gestures of generosity seemed genuine, covering tuition costs, paying for car repairs, and even assisting Daniel's mother with her mounting medical bills. James's wealth and influence became a safety net for Daniel, and he was deeply grateful. Their bond, at first, appeared to be one of mutual respect and trust. Over time, however, their relationship began to shift. James's interest in Daniel became more personal and less about mentorship. He began spending long hours with him, inviting him to dinner or private discussions that extended late into the night. The conversations often veered into deeply emotional territory, with James sharing stories of his struggles, his loneliness, and his longing for someone who truly understood him. Daniel, empathetic by nature, felt drawn to James's vulnerability. He began to see the pastor not just as a benefactor but as a man with desires and pain of his own. The turning point came during one of their late-night meetings. James expressed his feelings more openly, his words carrying a weight that Daniel could no longer ignore. At first, Daniel was stunned. The idea of someone as revered and powerful as James harboring romantic feelings for him was both shocking and intriguing. Daniel had never considered such a possibility, but as he reflected on their time together, he realized that his feelings for James were more complex than he had admitted to himself. Despite his growing affection for James, Daniel couldn't ignore the complication that was Lila. She had been his partner for years, a constant in his tumultuous life. Lila's love was unwavering, and she had supported him through his struggles without hesitation. The thought of hurting her was unbearable. Yet, the more time he spent with James, the more he felt himself being pulled in two directions. The pastor's unwavering attention and emotional depth awakened something in Daniel that he hadn't felt before, a sense of being truly seen and valued. The conflict within Daniel grew more pronounced as James began to push for more. The pastor, emboldened by Daniel's reciprocation, wanted their relationship to evolve into something deeper and more exclusive. He promised Daniel a life of comfort and security, offering access to his wealth and influence. James envisioned a future where they could be together without secrecy or fear, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that future a reality. For Daniel, the pressure was overwhelming. He found himself juggling the expectations of two people who loved him in different ways. Lila, unaware of the growing rift, continued to support Daniel, her devotion unwavering. Meanwhile, James grew increasingly insistent, his patience wearing thin as Daniel struggled to make a choice. The tension between the three of them, whether spoken or unspoken, loomed like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. As the weeks passed, the cracks in Daniel's life became harder to conceal. He began to withdraw from Lila, his guilt manifesting in avoidance and half-hearted excuses. She noticed the change but attributed it to stress, never suspecting the true cause. Daniel's time with James, meanwhile, grew more intense. Their private moments were charged with emotion, but they were also fraught with the unspoken reality of Daniel's indecision. James, accustomed to getting what he wanted, began to grow impatient. He saw Lila as an obstacle, someone who was holding Daniel back from embracing the life they could have together. The pastor's frustration bubbled beneath the surface, coloring his interactions with Daniel. While he maintained a veneer of understanding, it was clear that he expected Daniel to make a choice, and soon. Caught between his loyalties to Lila and his feelings for James, Daniel felt like he was living two lives. The weight of his deception began to take a toll on him, but he couldn't bring himself to sever ties with either of them. He rationalized his actions, telling himself that he needed more time to figure things out, but deep down, he knew that his indecision was hurting everyone involved. The balance Daniel tried so desperately to maintain was unsustainable. James's demands for exclusivity grew louder, while Lila's oblivious devotion became a constant reminder of the betrayal he was committing. The fragile web of lies and half-truths he had constructed was beginning to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. James's frustration with Daniel's indecision reached a breaking point. In his mind, Lila was the single obstacle preventing them from fully embracing the life he envisioned together. He had convinced himself that her presence in Daniel's life was not only unnecessary but detrimental. She didn't understand Daniel the way he did, nor could she offer him the opportunities and support that James could provide. James rationalized that by removing Lila, he was freeing Daniel from a relationship that was holding him back. It wasn't an act of malice, he told himself, it was an act of love. The plan began to take shape in James's mind with alarming clarity. He decided that the only way to eliminate Lila without arousing suspicion was to disguise his actions as an unfortunate accident. James carefully orchestrated an invitation, asking Lila to join him for a private dinner at the church's rectory. He framed the request as a gesture of goodwill, telling her that he wanted to discuss Daniel's future and how they could work together to support him. Lila, trusting James as a spiritual leader, readily agreed. In the days leading up to the dinner, James prepared meticulously. He procured a lethal poison, one that would act subtly and without immediate symptoms. He researched the dosage carefully, ensuring it would be undetectable in a casual setting. The wine he selected was expensive, chosen deliberately to lower Lila's guard and make her feel at ease. Every detail of the evening was planned to appear natural, from the arrangement of the table to the choice of topics he intended to discuss. When the evening arrived, James greeted Lila warmly, masking his intentions behind a facade of genuine concern. The rectory was dimly lit, with candles casting a soft glow over the table. The atmosphere was intimate but professional, designed to put her at ease. They began the evening with light conversation, discussing Daniel's potential and the challenges he faced. James praised Lila for her support and devotion, laying the groundwork for what he knew would be her final moments. As the evening progressed, James poured Lila a glass of wine. He watched her closely as she took the first sip, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. The poison was odorless and tasteless, mixed seamlessly into the wine. Lila showed no immediate signs of distress, which reassured James that his plan was working. They continued to talk, with James steering the conversation toward the future and the sacrifices necessary to help Daniel achieve his full potential. It wasn't until later in the evening that Lila began to feel unwell. She mentioned feeling lightheaded and nauseous, attributing it to fatigue or perhaps the wine itself. James feigned concern, offering her water and insisting that she sit down. As her condition worsened, he called for an ambulance, ensuring that his actions would appear as those of a concerned host. By the time the paramedics arrived, Lila was barely conscious. James maintained his composure, explaining to them that she had suddenly fallen ill during their conversation. Lila was rushed to the hospital, but the poison had already done its work. Despite the doctor's efforts, she succumbed to the effects within hours. The official cause of death was listed as acute organ failure, and no one initially suspected foul play. James ensured that his behavior remained above reproach, attending her funeral and offering heartfelt condolences to her grieving family and friends. His influence and standing within the community shielded him from scrutiny, and the incident was quietly mourned as a tragic loss. For James, the plan had gone exactly as intended, but the weight of his actions lingered in the back of his mind. He had achieved his goal, but at a cost that he couldn't entirely rationalize away. The image of Lila, trusting and unaware, haunted him in quiet moments. Yet, he convinced himself that it had been necessary, a sacrifice for the greater good of his relationship with Daniel. He believed that Daniel, free from the ties that bound him, would now see the path forward more clearly. What James failed to anticipate was the ripple effect of his actions. While the community mourned Lila's death, Daniel was consumed by grief. Her sudden passing left him devastated, and he turned to James for support, unaware of the role the pastor had played in her demise. James's plan had succeeded in bringing Daniel closer to him, but the foundation of their relationship was built on a lie that threatened to unravel everything. James had crossed the line, and though he had hidden his crime well, the truth had a way of surfacing, even in the most carefully constructed deceptions. Lila's death sent shockwaves through Daniel's life. He was consumed by grief, unable to reconcile the sudden loss of someone who had been his anchor. Overwhelmed by his emotions, he sought solace in James, the one person who seemed to understand his pain. James stepped into the role of a caretaker with calculated precision, offering comfort and support while carefully masking his own culpability. He attended every vigil and memorial, ensuring his presence was seen as both dutiful and compassionate. To Daniel, James appeared to be a steady hand in a turbulent sea. However, the circumstances surrounding Lila's death began to draw attention. Some members of the congregation whispered among themselves, finding it odd that she had spent her final evening with James. The dinner invitation, while ostensibly innocent, raised questions about its necessity and timing. A few skeptics, particularly those who had always viewed James's wealth and influence with suspicion, began to quietly probe into the details. The first real break in the facade came from an unlikely source, a hospital technician reviewing Lila's toxicology report. While her death had been attributed to natural causes, the technician noted anomalies in her blood work that pointed to the possibility of poisoning. These findings, though subtle, cast doubt on the initial conclusions. The technician shared their concerns with a colleague, who then passed the information along to a local investigator. While the evidence was circumstantial, it was enough to spark a quiet inquiry. Daniel, meanwhile, began noticing inconsistencies in James's version of events. While the pastor had been a source of comfort, his recounting of that fateful evening seemed rehearsed, as though he were carefully curating the narrative. Small details didn't align, and James's insistence on focusing on Daniel's grief rather than Lila's final moments struck an odd chord. Daniel's suspicion deepened when he found Lila's phone among her belongings. Scrolling through her messages, he came across a conversation with her best friend. In it, Lila mentioned that James had insisted on the dinner, describing his demeanor as unusually serious and cryptic. She had expressed a sense of unease, noting that he seemed eager to discuss something of great importance. This revelation unsettled Daniel, prompting him to confront James indirectly. He began asking pointed questions about the dinner and Lila's sudden illness. James, typically composed, faltered under the weight of the inquiries. He deflected with vague answers, emphasizing the tragedy of her loss rather than addressing the specifics. His evasiveness only fueled Daniel's growing doubts. The young man started piecing together fragments of conversations and observations, forming a picture that he couldn't ignore. As the informal investigation gained traction, whispers about the toxicology findings reached Daniel. Though no official accusations had been made, the idea that Lila's death might not have been natural horrified him. The weight of his suspicions became unbearable, and he found himself revisiting every interaction he'd had with James in the weeks leading up to and following Lila's death. The pastor's generosity, once comforting, now seemed calculated. His unwavering support took on a sinister undertone, as though it were a means of control rather than kindness. One evening, unable to contain his turmoil, Daniel decided to search for more evidence. He revisited Lila's belongings, combing through her personal items for anything that might shed light on her final hours. Among her notes, he found a journal entry written shortly before the dinner with James. In it, Lila expressed concern over the meeting, wondering why the pastor was so insistent on discussing Daniel's future. She had even joked about the possibility of James being overly controlling, though her tone suggested she hadn't taken her own concerns seriously. Armed with this information, Daniel confronted James directly. The conversation was tense, with Daniel demanding answers and James scrambling to maintain control. The pastor's demeanor shifted from defensive to dismissive, as though he believed he could manipulate Daniel into dropping the subject. However, Daniel's persistence was unyielding, and James's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The once charismatic pastor now appeared cornered, his confidence eroding under Daniel's scrutiny. James's refusal to provide clear answers only solidified Daniel's resolve. He realized that the man he had trusted and admired was not the person he claimed to be. The seeds of doubt had grown into a full-blown certainty that James had been involved in Lila's death. Daniel knew that uncovering the truth would come at a cost, but the weight of his guilt and grief left him with no other choice. The pastor's hold over him was slipping, and for the first time, Daniel saw James not as a mentor or a lover, but as a dangerous man desperate to protect his own secrets. Daniel, tormented by his growing suspicions, decided he could no longer rely on conjecture alone. He reached out to the local police, carefully and anonymously, providing them with Lila's journal entries, text messages, and the circumstances surrounding her final meeting with Pastor James. His aim was simple: uncover the truth about Lila's death, even if it meant facing the possibility that someone he had trusted was responsible. The authorities, already aware of inconsistencies in Lila's toxicology report, took Daniel's information seriously. Detectives began to investigate quietly, retracing the events of that fateful evening. Interviews with medical staff who treated Lila revealed subtle anomalies in her symptoms that suggested poisoning. Further analysis of her blood samples confirmed the presence of a substance commonly used in rodenticides, rare and tightly regulated. Their investigation pointed to one person with both access to such a substance and proximity to the victim, Pastor James Wilkes. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered additional pieces of evidence that painted a damning picture. Financial records linked James to a supplier of the poison, masked under the pretense of pest control expenses for the church property. Witnesses recalled James's insistence on hosting the private dinner with Lila, noting how unusual it was for the pastor to meet one-on-one with congregants in such a setting. Even the seemingly benign details, the choice of wine, the specific timing of the invitation, began to align into a chilling narrative. Daniel was notified of the investigation's progress, and the confirmation of James's involvement left him devastated. The man he had idolized and loved had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Every kind gesture, every comforting word from James now felt like a calculated move to manipulate him. The weight of this realization crushed Daniel, filling him with guilt and rage. He blamed himself for not acting sooner, for allowing James's influence to blind him to the truth. His grief over Lila's death transformed into a burning desire for accountability. Unable to bear the emotional burden alone, Daniel confronted James directly. He arranged to meet him under the guise of seeking closure, choosing a neutral and public location to ensure his own safety. When they met, Daniel's composure quickly gave way to anger. He demanded to know why James had done it, why he had chosen such a monstrous path. James, cornered and desperate, tried to justify his actions. He claimed that everything he had done was out of love for Daniel, that Lila's presence was preventing them from achieving the future they deserved. But his rationalizations only fueled Daniel's fury. James's words were a grotesque distortion of love, a self-serving justification for murder. Daniel's voice shook with rage as he accused James of destroying not only Lila's life, but their own as well. The confrontation grew heated, and for the first time, James's composed facade shattered completely. He pleaded, cajoled, and threatened, cycling through every tactic in his arsenal to regain control of the situation. But Daniel was resolute. The man standing before him was no longer the mentor he had admired, but a dangerous manipulator whose actions had shattered countless lives. The meeting ended without resolution, but it marked the beginning of the end for James. Daniel, now armed with the full truth, cooperated with the police, providing testimony that corroborated their findings. His statement was the final piece of the puzzle, solidifying the case against the pastor. Shortly afterward, James was arrested in a quiet but decisive operation. The charges against him included premeditated murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of his position as a spiritual leader. The fallout from James's arrest was swift and far-reaching. The community, once devoted to him, was left reeling from the revelation of his crimes. His church, a cornerstone of the town, became a symbol of betrayal and deceit. Congregants abandoned the institution in droves, and James's allies in business and politics distanced themselves to preserve their own reputations. The wealth and power he had wielded for decades crumbled in an instant, leaving only disgrace in its wake. Daniel, overwhelmed by guilt and sorrow, chose to leave the town behind. The memories were too painful, the wounds too raw. He packed his belongings and set out to start anew, seeking a place where he could begin to heal from the trauma that had consumed his life. The road ahead was uncertain, but Daniel knew that he could no longer remain in the shadow of the past. In 2012, on a warm spring morning in Savannah, Georgia, the calm of a quiet residential neighborhood was shattered by an urgent call to 911 at precisely 7:34 a.m. The caller, a distraught woman, identified herself as Elizabeth Grayson. Her panicked voice was nearly incomprehensible as she reported that her husband, Martin Grayson, was lying lifeless in their garage. First responders were dispatched immediately to the address, a large, well-maintained property on the outskirts of the city. Upon arrival, the paramedics and police officers were met with a grim scene. Martin Grayson, a prominent local pastor, was found sprawled on the cold concrete floor of the garage, his body positioned unnaturally. His left arm was bent beneath him, and faint abrasions were visible on his hands and forearms, as though he had fallen or struggled before losing consciousness. A faint trace of blood was noted on his lower lip, and his eyes remained partially open, staring blankly upward. There were no obvious signs of forced entry or foul play at first glance, but the circumstances raised immediate questions. The garage was meticulously organized, a reflection of the disciplined lifestyle Martin was known for. His black luxury sedan was parked neatly in its designated space, and a set of golf clubs rested against the far wall. Nearby, a workbench held neatly arranged tools, none appearing disturbed. Yet, something about the scene felt off to the investigators. The position of the body and the minor injuries did not align with a simple medical emergency. The attending paramedics pronounced Martin dead at the scene, prompting the police to secure the area for a formal investigation. The lead investigator, Detective Raymond Holloway, arrived shortly after the initial response team. A seasoned officer with over 2 decades of experience, Holloway quickly noted inconsistencies. While the preliminary assumption was a heart attack, the abrasions on Martin's hands suggested an element of physical activity or resistance. Furthermore, the faint scent of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air, an unusual detail given the otherwise pristine condition of the space. As the investigation proceeded, Elizabeth Grayson was questioned by officers in the living room of the house. Still in shock, she recounted discovering her husband's body less than an hour earlier. According to her, Martin had left their bedroom early that morning, something he occasionally did to prepare for his day or to spend time alone in reflection and prayer. When he failed to return for breakfast, Elizabeth had gone to look for him, eventually finding him in the garage. Elizabeth's account of the events painted a picture of a loving, devoted husband and community leader. She described Martin as a disciplined man who took his health seriously, making the notion of a sudden heart attack all the more surprising. Her tears were genuine, but her responses hinted at an undercurrent of anxiety beyond grief, a detail noted by Detective Holloway. Martin Grayson was a man of prominence in Savannah. Born in 1971 in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, he had risen to prominence through sheer determination and an unshakable faith. As a young man, Martin displayed a natural charisma and intelligence that set him apart from his peers. He graduated with honors from a prestigious theological seminary, earning accolades for his oratory skills and deep understanding of Scripture. By his mid-30s, Martin had become the senior pastor of the Savannah Baptist Cathedral, one of the city's largest and most influential churches. Martin was more than a religious leader, he was a community figure. His sermons regularly attracted thousands, and his philanthropic efforts extended to establishing food drives, scholarships for underprivileged youth, and rehabilitation programs for former inmates. To many, Martin was the embodiment of moral and spiritual leadership, a man who had seemingly achieved the perfect balance of personal and professional fulfillment. Elizabeth Grayson, his wife of 10 years, had been an integral part of his journey. Born in 1975 in rural Georgia, Elizabeth had faced her own share of challenges. Orphaned at a young age, she was raised by a strict yet caring grandmother who instilled in her a sense of resilience and ambition. Elizabeth excelled academically, earning a law degree before meeting Martin at a charity gala. Their courtship was swift and deeply romantic, with Martin's steadfast commitment to faith complementing Elizabeth's practical and grounded nature. Their marriage was widely regarded as a partnership of equals, each supporting the other in their respective endeavors. Elizabeth had put her legal career on hold to focus on family life, a decision she later described as fulfilling but challenging. Together, they raised Elizabeth's son from a previous relationship, Jason, now 19, whom Martin had embraced as his own. The discovery of Martin's body sent shockwaves through the community. News of the pastor's sudden death spread rapidly, drawing reporters and curious onlookers to the Grayson home. Inside, investigators began a painstaking examination of the garage, photographing every angle and collecting samples for forensic analysis. The autopsy, they hoped, would provide answers, but the evidence on the scene suggested that this case would be far from straightforward. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the garage was cordoned off with crime scene tape, marking the beginning of an investigation that would unravel secrets buried deep within the seemingly perfect life of Martin Grayson. For now, his death remained a mystery, but Detective Holloway knew one thing for certain: appearances could be deceiving, and every detail mattered. Before marrying Martin Grayson, Elizabeth was a single mother raising her son, Jason, on her own. At the time of their marriage, Jason was 9 years old, a bright and spirited child with an aptitude for academics and an interest in creative pursuits. Elizabeth often described him as mature for his age, a boy who displayed sensitivity and intelligence far beyond his years. Jason's natural talents were evident early on. He excelled in school, showing a particular affinity for mathematics and design, which led to his dream of becoming an architect. He balanced his academic achievements with an active interest in music, playing the piano, and participating in his school's basketball team. When Martin entered their lives, he quickly assumed the role of a father figure. Despite never having children of his own, Martin embraced the responsibilities of parenting with enthusiasm and commitment. He encouraged Jason's interests, attended school functions, and often took him to church activities. By all appearances, Martin treated Jason as his own son, and their bond grew naturally over time. Neighbors and friends frequently commented on the harmonious dynamic within the Grayson household, describing them as a model family. Jason, in turn, respected Martin and seemed to enjoy the stability and guidance he provided. For a time, their relationship was unremarkable in the best sense, marked by mutual respect and a shared routine. Jason admired Martin's discipline and community presence, while Martin saw in Jason a bright future and the opportunity to instill his values in the younger generation. They frequently worked on small projects together, like assembling model buildings or fixing things around the house, further strengthening their connection. However, as Jason grew older, the dynamics began to shift subtly. By the time he turned 16, Jason's personality had evolved, and he began to exhibit traits of independence and self-assurance that often accompany adolescence. His physical appearance also changed. He was tall, athletic, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that did not go unnoticed. Martin began to notice these changes, and while on the surface his behavior remained supportive and fatherly, there were moments when his attention lingered on Jason in ways that unsettled him. Martin's observations of Jason became more frequent and introspective. He would sometimes find himself watching the boy during casual family moments, noticing details that he could not explain or rationalize. The way Jason interacted with others, his charm, his easy smile, his natural charisma, seemed to capture Martin's attention more than he cared to admit. Martin dismissed these thoughts as a byproduct of his role as a stepfather, interpreting them as concern for Jason's well-being and future. Still, a growing discomfort lingered, as though a boundary was being tested, even if only in Martin's mind. From Jason's perspective, his relationship with Martin remained largely unchanged during this period. He appreciated Martin's involvement in his life and seemed oblivious to the internal conflict his stepfather was experiencing. Jason continued to thrive academically, earning high marks in school and gaining early recognition for his architectural sketches, which he often showed to Martin for feedback. He also maintained his passion for music, practicing piano in the evenings and occasionally performing at church events, where Martin's pride in him was evident. Yet, there were moments of tension that neither of them fully acknowledged. Martin's demeanor occasionally shifted in Jason's presence, becoming quieter, more pensive. Elizabeth noticed these subtle changes but attributed them to the stress of Martin's demanding role as a pastor. She remained unaware of the complexities brewing beneath the surface, interpreting their interactions as the natural evolution of a stepfather-son relationship. The outward harmony of the Grayson household masked these undercurrents, creating a veneer of normalcy that would eventually begin to crack. The strength of their bond, once unquestionable, now carried a weight that neither Martin nor Jason could fully articulate. Their shared history and mutual respect held them together, but beneath it all, something intangible began to grow, a tension that would later reveal itself in unexpected and irrevocable ways. For now, the Grayson family continued their daily lives, unaware of the storm quietly brewing within their seemingly idyllic world. In the summer of 2012, Martin Grayson suggested to Jason that they take a weekend fishing trip to a secluded lake just outside Savannah, Georgia. The plan seemed innocuous, even wholesome, a chance for them to bond away from the responsibilities and distractions of daily life. For Jason, it was an opportunity to enjoy nature and spend time with his stepfather, who had been increasingly supportive of his interests. For Martin, it was an opportunity to strengthen their relationship under the guise of mentorship. Elizabeth, unaware of any underlying tensions, encouraged the trip, delighted by the apparent camaraderie between her husband and her son. The destination was a small, remote lake nestled in a wooded area about 50 miles from the city. Known for its serene beauty, the site was popular among locals for camping and fishing. Martin and Jason arrived late on a Friday afternoon, parking their truck near the lake's edge and setting up a modest campsite. The equipment included a small tent, 2 fishing rods, a cooler filled with supplies, and a portable grill for cooking their catch. The weather was ideal, clear skies with a light breeze, casting a golden glow over the rippling water. That evening, they sat side by side on the lake's shore, their fishing lines cast into the water. The quietness of the surroundings was interrupted only by the occasional chirping of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. Martin, typically composed and confident, appeared uncharacteristically introspective. He frequently glanced at Jason, whose relaxed demeanor contrasted with the unease that Martin was trying to suppress. Jason, oblivious to the complexity of Martin's thoughts, chatted casually about school, his architectural ambitions, and his recent piano recital. Martin listened attentively, occasionally nodding, but his responses grew increasingly curt as the evening wore on. As night fell, the two retreated to their tent. The confined space and the intimacy of their environment heightened the tension that had been simmering throughout the day. The tent was small, with barely enough room for the two sleeping bags laid side by side. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the faint remnants of smoke from their earlier campfire. Jason, tired from the day's activities, settled into his sleeping bag, unaware of the internal conflict raging within Martin. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the faint hum of nocturnal insects outside. The turning point came when Martin, unable to contain his emotions, acted on an impulse that had been building for months. He leaned over and kissed Jason, a gesture that crossed every boundary of their relationship. Jason, initially stunned, did not pull away. Instead, he reciprocated, an act that signaled his own confusion and curiosity about the situation. What followed was a night that irrevocably changed the nature of their bond. The next morning, the tension between them had dissipated, replaced by a strange and unspoken understanding. They packed up their campsite in near silence, avoiding direct eye contact but exchanging occasional glances that hinted at the gravity of what had occurred. Martin appeared calm, even serene, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Jason, while quieter than usual, seemed contemplative rather than distressed. Upon their return home, Elizabeth greeted them warmly, delighted to see her husband and son appearing closer than ever. She commented on how the trip had clearly been a success, noting the ease and camaraderie in their interactions. Martin and Jason played along, their shared secret remaining buried beneath layers of practiced normalcy. To Elizabeth, the fishing trip was a triumph, a bonding experience that reinforced the strength of their family. She had no way of knowing that the weekend had marked the beginning of a clandestine relationship that would later unravel their lives. For now, the Grayson household returned to its usual rhythm, the events of the fishing trip concealed behind the polished facade of their seemingly perfect family dynamic. Following their return from the fishing trip, Martin and Jason's relationship took on an entirely new dynamic. What had once been a conventional stepfather-stepson bond was now complicated by an intimacy they both went to great lengths to conceal. Their shared secret became a silent agreement, one that demanded vigilance and subtlety to avoid detection. This secrecy created a charged atmosphere within the Grayson household, though Elizabeth remained unaware of the growing tension. At family dinners, their interactions were marked by fleeting glances and unspoken communication. Jason, usually animated and conversational, became more reserved, often catching Martin's eye across the table. Martin, typically composed and articulate, seemed distracted, his responses to Elizabeth's questions sometimes delayed or absent altogether. While their behavior might have seemed innocuous to an outsider, it was clear to those who knew them well that something had shifted. Their moments of connection were carefully orchestrated. Martin would create opportunities for them to be alone, whether under the pretense of helping Jason with a project or discussing church activities. These interactions were brief and calculated, with both parties acutely aware of the need for discretion. Late at night, when the rest of the household was asleep, they would exchange text messages, their conversations laced with coded language and references only they understood. These moments of connection sustained their relationship, but the constant need for secrecy began to take its toll. Martin's behavior outside the home also began to change. He started attending more meetings and spending longer hours at the church. While these absences were easily explained as the demands of his role as pastor, they became more frequent and irregular. Elizabeth, initially supportive of her husband's dedication, began to grow suspicious. She noticed subtle inconsistencies in his explanations and a detachment in his demeanor that was uncharacteristic of the attentive and engaged partner she had married. Jason, too, began to struggle with the weight of their secret. Though he continued to excel academically, his focus waned. Teachers noted a drop in his usual enthusiasm, and friends commented on his increasing withdrawal from social activities. At home, he spent more time in his room, avoiding unnecessary interactions with Elizabeth to minimize the risk of revealing their secret. The once lively and open dynamic between mother and son became strained, though Elizabeth attributed this to typical teenage mood swings. Tension in the household began to escalate as Elizabeth's suspicions grew. She started questioning Martin more directly about his late nights and frequent absences. His responses, while measured and logical, failed to fully assuage her concerns. She also noticed subtle changes in Jason's behavior, such as his reluctance to spend time with her and his tendency to avoid conversations about Martin. These observations, though disjointed, planted seeds of doubt in Elizabeth's mind. Outside the home, Martin worked to maintain his reputation as a dedicated spiritual leader. His sermons continued to draw large crowds, and his involvement in community initiatives remained unwavering. However, those closest to him began to notice signs of strain. He seemed more preoccupied, occasionally losing his train of thought during meetings and appearing less engaged in casual interactions. His inner turmoil, though well hidden, began to seep through the cracks of his polished exterior. The secrecy of their relationship demanded constant vigilance, and the pressure began to affect both Martin and Jason in different ways. For Martin, the duplicity clashed with the moral values he had built his life around, creating a growing sense of guilt and self-loathing. For Jason, the secrecy isolated him from his peers and family, leaving him with a sense of confusion and vulnerability. The weight of their secret created an invisible barrier within the Grayson household, one that Elizabeth could sense but not yet fully understand. As the weeks turned into months, the fragile equilibrium of their lives became increasingly unsustainable. Martin and Jason's clandestine relationship, though carefully concealed, began to leave traces, subtle shifts in behavior, unexplained absences, and moments of tension that hinted at deeper fractures within their seemingly perfect family. These cracks would eventually widen, leading to a series of events that would shatter the Grayson household and expose the truth they had worked so hard to hide. For now, however, the secret remained intact, a shadow looming over their lives, waiting for the moment it would come to light. On a humid morning in late summer, Elizabeth Grayson awoke earlier than usual, her routine disrupted by a sense of unease she couldn't explain. The house was unusually silent, and Martin, who typically prepared coffee before heading out for his day, was nowhere to be seen. Assuming he might have gone to the garage to retrieve something, Elizabeth decided to look for him. As she approached the garage door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, an unusual detail that only heightened her growing apprehension. Stepping inside, she was immediately struck by the scene before her. Martin was lying on the cold cement floor, motionless. His arms were splayed awkwardly, one tucked beneath his torso, the other extended toward the nearby workbench. His face was partially turned to one side, revealing a faint trail of dried blood from his nose and mouth. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his normally composed expression was replaced with one of frozen anguish. Elizabeth's first reaction was panic. She rushed to his side, shaking him and calling his name, but there was no response. His body was cold to the touch, and she noticed faint abrasions on his hands and wrists, as though he had struggled or fallen before losing consciousness. Nearby, a toolbox had been knocked over, its contents scattered across the floor. A small smear of blood marked the edge of the workbench, and a faint chemical odor lingered in the air. Frantic, Elizabeth called 911, her voice trembling as she reported her husband's condition. Within minutes, paramedics and police officers arrived, their presence shattering the eerie stillness of the morning. The paramedics confirmed what Elizabeth had already feared: Martin was dead. They noted his injuries, though minor, and his unnatural position, which suggested that his death had not been immediate or peaceful. Detective Raymond Holloway, who had recently been assigned to the case, arrived shortly after the initial responders. Holloway was a seasoned investigator, known for his methodical approach and keen attention to detail. As he surveyed the scene, several inconsistencies caught his attention. While the abrasions on Martin's hands could be explained by a fall, the small bloodstains and the scattered tools indicated a possible struggle. The chemical odor, faint but distinct, also raised questions about whether something had been spilled or used to clean part of the scene. The garage itself was meticulously organized, a reflection of Martin's disciplined nature. Tools were neatly arranged on the workbench, except for those that had fallen, and the floor was unusually clean for a workspace. However, Holloway noticed subtle disturbances, a slight smudge on the edge of the workbench that could have been made by a hand or object, and a faint trail of scuff marks leading toward the garage door, as though someone had dragged their feet. Elizabeth, still in shock, was escorted to the living room for questioning. She recounted finding Martin and insisted that he had no known health issues that could explain his sudden death. She also mentioned that Martin had been working late nights recently, though she had no reason to believe he was under any unusual stress. Her account, while emotional, offered little clarity about the circumstances leading to Martin's death. Back in the garage, the forensic team began their work. They collected samples of the bloodstains and photographed every detail of the scene, from the scattered tools to the smudges and scuff marks. An initial examination of Martin's body revealed no immediately fatal injuries, though the blood at the scene suggested some degree of trauma. The chemical odor was traced to a small, half-empty bottle of cleaning solvent on a nearby shelf, though its relevance to the case remained unclear. As news of Martin's death spread, the community was shocked. Martin was a beloved pastor and public figure, known for his dedication to his church and his charitable work. His sudden death, especially under circumstances that appeared suspicious, sent ripples of grief and speculation through Savannah. Friends and congregants gathered outside the Grayson home, offering support to Elizabeth and Jason, who had remained upstairs during the commotion. For Detective Holloway, the case was anything but straightforward. While there were no clear signs of foul play, the inconsistencies at the scene suggested that Martin's death might not have been accidental or natural. The abrasions, the blood, and the chemical odor all pointed to the possibility of a struggle or an attempt to alter the scene. With no immediate witnesses or suspects, the investigation would rely heavily on forensic analysis and a closer examination of Martin's personal and professional life. As the forensic team packed up their equipment and Martin's body was transported for autopsy, Holloway lingered in the garage, reviewing his notes. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth behind Martin's death lay hidden in the seemingly mundane details of the scene. For now, the cause of death remained a mystery, but Holloway was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried it might be. The investigation into Martin Grayson's death began immediately after the initial scene examination. Detective Raymond Holloway led a team of investigators tasked with piecing together the events leading to the pastor's mysterious demise. With no witnesses and only circumstantial evidence at the scene, the case relied heavily on interviews, forensic analysis, and the reconstruction of Martin's final days. The high-profile nature of the case added pressure, as Martin was a respected figure in the Savannah community, and his death had drawn significant public attention. Holloway's first step was to interview the immediate family. Elizabeth Grayson provided a detailed account of her discovery of Martin's body but could offer little insight into potential motives or suspects. Jason, visibly shaken, claimed he had been asleep when his stepfather died and had no knowledge of any conflicts or unusual behavior. Their statements, while consistent, left many questions unanswered. Next, the police turned their attention to Martin's professional life. As a prominent pastor, Martin had extensive connections within the community. Investigators began by interviewing members of his congregation, focusing on those who had regular interactions with him. One of the first names to surface was Walter Bishop, a longtime church member who had recently expressed dissatisfaction with Martin's handling of church finances. According to other congregants, Walter had accused Martin of mismanaging funds allocated for a community outreach program. The dispute had escalated to the point where Walter had confronted Martin publicly, making vague threats about exposing his secrets. Walter was brought in for questioning. He admitted to the confrontation but denied any involvement in Martin's death. Investigators found his alibi credible. On the night before the body was discovered, Walter had been at home hosting a gathering with friends, several of whom corroborated his story. While his threats had raised suspicion, there was no evidence linking him to the scene. This lead, though promising, ultimately proved to be a dead end. Holloway then shifted focus to Martin's personal life, looking for clues that might suggest hidden tensions or conflicts. During their inquiry, the name Luke Harper repeatedly surfaced. Luke was a young administrative assistant at the church, responsible for managing schedules, correspondence, and events. Witnesses described Luke as a close confidant of Martin's, noting that the two often spent time together outside of work hours. This relationship, while seemingly professional, raised eyebrows due to its perceived intensity and frequency. Investigators dug deeper into Luke's background and his interactions with Martin. Emails and text messages between the two revealed a pattern of communication that extended beyond work matters. The messages, while not overtly incriminating, hinted at a level of intimacy that suggested a personal relationship. Additionally, multiple witnesses reported seeing Martin and Luke meeting privately on several occasions, often in secluded locations. Holloway brought Luke in for questioning. Initially cooperative, Luke admitted to having a close relationship with Martin but insisted it was purely platonic. He explained the frequent meetings as discussions about church operations and denied any knowledge of conflicts or secrets that might have led to Martin's death. When pressed about his whereabouts on the night before the body was found, Luke provided an alibi, claiming he had been at a friend's house watching a movie. His alibi was later confirmed by multiple witnesses, forcing investigators to rule him out as a suspect. Despite these setbacks, the investigation continued to uncover fragments of Martin's life that painted a more complex picture of the man behind the pulpit. Financial records revealed minor discrepancies in church accounts, though not significant enough to suggest embezzlement or fraud. Forensic analysis of Martin's phone and laptop uncovered encrypted files that hinted at a private side of his life, but these proved difficult to access without further technical support. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the garage provided limited insight. The bloodstains on the workbench and floor were confirmed to be Martin's, but there were no foreign fingerprints or DNA present at the scene. The chemical odor was traced to a cleaning solvent found in the garage, though it appeared to have been spilled accidentally rather than used to obscure evidence. The abrasions on Martin's hands and the scattered tools suggested a struggle, but there was no indication of another person's involvement. As days turned into weeks, the investigation grew increasingly complex. Each lead, no matter how promising, seemed to unravel under scrutiny. The community's initial shock began to give way to speculation and rumors, with theories ranging from a botched burglary to a secret vendetta. Despite the mounting pressure, Holloway remained determined to uncover the truth. He knew that somewhere within the web of lies and half-truths, the key to solving Martin's death was waiting to be found. For now, however, the case remained a puzzle, its pieces scattered and incomplete. As the investigation into Martin Grayson's death progressed, the pressure mounted on everyone involved, particularly Jason. The police's methodical questioning and their focus on the relationships in Martin's personal life created an atmosphere of unease within the Grayson household. Jason, already grappling with guilt and fear, found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. Every new development in the investigation brought him closer to breaking point. Detective Holloway and his team had narrowed their focus to the people closest to Martin, piecing together fragments of his hidden life. The evidence pointing to Martin's secret relationship with Luke Harper had become impossible to ignore, and the detectives believed they were on the brink of uncovering a motive for his death. Jason, realizing the police might soon unravel the truth about his relationship with Martin, began to exhibit signs of extreme distress. He withdrew further from his mother, avoided the police when they visited, and spent hours alone in his room. Eventually, Jason could no longer bear the weight of the secret. Overcome by fear and guilt, he confessed to the crime. In a tearful statement to the police, he revealed that on the night before Martin's death, he had confronted his stepfather after discovering text messages on Martin's phone that exposed his ongoing affair with Luke. Jason described how his initial shock turned into a storm of rage and betrayal. The messages confirmed his worst fear: Martin had been unfaithful, not only to Elizabeth, but to him as well. According to Jason's confession, the confrontation escalated quickly. In the garage, where Martin had retreated for solitude, Jason confronted him with the evidence of his betrayal. What began as a heated argument soon turned physical. Jason admitted to shoving Martin in a moment of rage, causing him to stumble backward into the workbench. Martin struck his head on the edge of the bench, leaving him dazed and bleeding. Jason claimed he panicked as Martin collapsed to the ground, and instead of calling for help, he fled the scene, leaving his stepfather to die. Jason's confession painted a picture of a young man overwhelmed by conflicting emotions: love, betrayal, jealousy, and anger. He described his relationship with Martin as one that had started innocently but evolved into something neither of them could fully control. The discovery of Martin's infidelity with Luke shattered the fragile bond they had built, driving Jason to an act of violence that he would later regret. Elizabeth was informed of Jason's confession shortly after his arrest. The news devastated her, leaving her grappling with the dual loss of her husband and son. Learning the full extent of Martin's secret life and his relationship with Jason shattered her perception of the man she had loved and trusted. Her idealized image of their family was irreparably destroyed, replaced by a painful reality she could barely comprehend. Jason was charged with manslaughter, and the case proceeded to trial. The courtroom proceedings drew widespread attention, as the details of Martin's hidden life and the circumstances of his death became public knowledge. The revelations tarnished Martin's reputation, casting a shadow over his legacy as a respected pastor and community leader. Elizabeth, though supportive of her son, struggled to reconcile her grief with the betrayal and lies that had defined her husband's final years. At the trial, the defense presented Jason's actions as the result of emotional turmoil and manipulation, arguing that his relationship with Martin had placed him in a vulnerable position. The prosecution, however, focused on the premeditation and severity of Jason's actions, highlighting his decision to leave Martin to die rather than seeking help. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Jason guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to a term in a juvenile correctional facility, given his age and lack of prior offenses. In the aftermath, Elizabeth chose to leave Savannah, unable to face the constant reminders of her shattered family and the public scandal that surrounded Martin's death. The church, once a pillar of the community, faced significant fallout, with members divided over the revelations about their former pastor. Martin Grayson's name, once synonymous with integrity and faith, became a cautionary tale of hidden lives and the destructive power of secrets. In 2009, the picturesque town of Asheville, North Carolina, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, was a sanctuary for its residents. Among them was Pastor James Whitaker, a man whose life embodied discipline and faith. At 43 years old, James had spent over 2 decades serving in the Marine Corps before retiring to dedicate himself to spiritual service. His strong physique and regimented demeanor bore the marks of his military past, yet his calm and measured voice carried the compassion and wisdom that had earned him the respect of his congregation at Harmony Baptist Church. James's days followed a structured routine. He rose before dawn, spending an hour in prayer and scripture before preparing breakfast for his family. His wife, Naomi, often joined him in the kitchen, her presence adding warmth to their shared rituals. By 8 a.m., James was usually at the church, organizing community outreach programs, preparing sermons, and offering guidance to parishioners. His evenings were reserved for family, dinners filled with laughter and lessons, followed by quiet moments spent reading with their 6-year-old daughter, Grace. Naomi Whitaker, 10 years James's junior, was a beacon of grace and steadfast faith. Born and raised in Asheville, she had grown up in the church, her musical talent evident from a young age. By the time she met James, she was a Sunday school teacher and the church's lead pianist. Her nurturing spirit extended beyond her family. She was often the first to volunteer for community events, bringing meals to the sick or organizing fundraisers for local charities. Naomi's gentle demeanor and unwavering optimism made her beloved by the congregation, where she was affectionately referred to as the Heart of Harmony Baptist. Grace, their daughter, was a lively and inquisitive child with her mother's warm smile and her father's sense of discipline. Though young, she already displayed a talent for drawing, often creating pictures inspired by the Bible stories her parents told her. She was the joy of James's life, and he often remarked that her laughter was the best part of his day. James and Naomi's love story was the cornerstone of their family. They had met 6 years earlier at a community charity event hosted by Harmony Baptist. At the time, James was newly retired from the Marines and had been invited to speak about his transition to civilian life. Naomi, who was performing at the event, caught his eye immediately. Her radiant smile and skillful piano playing captivated him, and after her performance, James offered to help carry her equipment to her car. Their initial conversation was simple but profound. They spoke about faith, family, and their shared desire to serve others. Over the following weeks, James found reasons to attend church events where he knew Naomi would be. Naomi, in turn, began looking forward to their encounters, drawn to his strength and quiet confidence. The turning point in their relationship came one crisp autumn evening. James had invited Naomi for a walk along a scenic trail near the church. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he handed her a handwritten letter. In it, he expressed his feelings, detailing how her kindness and faith had renewed his own. Alongside the letter was a bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered himself. Naomi was deeply touched, and by the time their walk ended, they both knew they wanted to build a life together. Their engagement was brief but joyous. Within 6 months, they were married in a simple yet beautiful ceremony at Harmony Baptist, surrounded by family and friends. Naomi wore a vintage lace gown passed down from her grandmother, and James donned his marine dress blues, a nod to his past. For their honeymoon, they chose Charleston, South Carolina, a city rich with history and charm. They stayed in a quaint bed and breakfast, spending their days exploring historic landmarks and their evenings dining by candlelight. The cobblestone streets and ocean breeze provided a perfect backdrop for their conversations about the future. They spoke of the family they wanted to build, the home they would create, and the ways they could serve their community together. When they returned to Asheville, they began their life as a team, each complementing the other's strengths. James's disciplined approach to leadership and Naomi's nurturing spirit made them a formidable pair, both at home and within their church. For years, their life seemed idyllic, a reflection of their shared faith and mutual devotion. Yet, as time went on, subtle cracks would begin to form in the foundation of their seemingly perfect life. Unbeknownst to James, the path they had so carefully planned was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. For now, however, the Whitakers were the epitome of a loving and faithful family, standing as a beacon of hope and unity in their small community. By the time their daughter Grace turned 6, James Whitaker began noticing changes in Naomi that unsettled him. Naomi, who had always been a pillar of energy and optimism, started exhibiting signs of fatigue. She often retired early in the evenings, leaving James to finish their nightly routine with Grace alone. Initially, he attributed this to the natural toll of juggling her many responsibilities at church and home, but as the weeks turned into months, the pattern grew more concerning. Naomi's once predictable schedule became erratic. She would leave the house without providing clear reasons, sometimes returning hours later with vague explanations that didn't quite align with her usual transparency. Her presence at church events diminished, replaced by hurried excuses about other commitments. James, who valued structure and honesty, found it difficult to reconcile these inconsistencies with the woman he had known for so many years. Small arguments began to surface. At first, they revolved around mundane matters, forgotten appointments or misplaced items. But these disagreements became more frequent and emotionally charged. Naomi's responses to James's concerns felt evasive, a stark contrast to the open communication they had once shared. Her defensiveness only fueled James's growing unease, and their once harmonious household began to feel fractured. Despite his frustrations, James sought to understand the root of the changes. He turned to prayer, spending long hours in his study, asking for clarity and guidance. His faith had always been his anchor, and he hoped that divine intervention would illuminate the path forward. Yet, the answers he sought eluded him, leaving him grappling with a sense of helplessness he was unaccustomed to. The situation escalated when James noticed discrepancies in their finances. Reviewing their bank statements, he was alarmed to see several large withdrawals from their joint account. The amounts were significant, far beyond what was typical for their household expenses. Moreover, the withdrawals had been made at irregular intervals, often coinciding with Naomi's unexplained absences. James's military training had instilled in him a meticulous attention to detail, and these financial irregularities set off alarms he couldn't ignore. James approached Naomi with the bank statements, hoping for a straightforward explanation. Instead, her responses were vague and unconvincing, filled with half-answers that only deepened his suspicions. Her unwillingness to provide clarity left James feeling betrayed, and for the first time in their marriage, he questioned her honesty. The foundation of trust they had built over the years felt increasingly fragile, and James found himself consumed by doubt. Naomi's behavior extended beyond the financial discrepancies. She became more withdrawn, often spending hours alone in their bedroom or taking long walks without explanation. Her physical appearance also began to change subtly. Her once radiant complexion appeared pallid, and she seemed to have lost weight. When James asked if she was feeling unwell, she brushed off his concerns, attributing it to stress or lack of sleep. However, these dismissals did little to ease James's mind. Their home, once a sanctuary of faith and love, became a battleground of unspoken tension. Grace, though young, seemed to sense the shift in her parents' relationship. Her usually cheerful demeanor became subdued, and she often sought solace in drawing, retreating into her own world to avoid the growing strain between her parents. As weeks turned into months, James's unease transformed into a relentless need for answers. He began observing Naomi more closely, noting the time she left the house and the duration of her absences. Though he stopped short of confronting her outright, his mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He wondered if she was involved in something illegal or if her faith had wavered. The thought of infidelity, though painful to consider, loomed large in his mind. James clung to his faith as a source of strength, yet even prayer couldn't silence the nagging doubts that consumed him. He felt trapped between his role as a husband committed to protecting his family and his fear of uncovering a truth that might shatter the life they had built. Each unanswered question eroded his peace, leaving him restless and increasingly isolated. The cracks in their marriage, once small and unnoticeable, widened with each passing day. James found himself at a crossroads, unsure whether to confront Naomi directly or to continue observing in silence. His heart told him to trust in God's plan, but his instincts as a Marine urged him to take action. For now, he chose to wait, hoping that time would bring the clarity he desperately needed. Unbeknownst to him, the answers he sought would soon come to light, but not in the way he had imagined. James Whitaker's suspicions reached a boiling point one crisp autumn evening. Naomi had announced she would be visiting a friend, her tone casual but distant. Over the past few months, her unexplained absences had become more frequent, and James felt he could no longer ignore the unsettling patterns. This time, he decided to follow her, driven by a mix of fear, betrayal, and a need for answers. Naomi left their home at dusk, driving her modest sedan into town. James followed discreetly, keeping several car lengths behind. His training as a Marine kicked in, allowing him to maintain a steady, calculated pace without drawing attention. As he trailed her, his mind raced with scenarios, each one more troubling than the last. He prayed silently for clarity, yet he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread. After a 20-minute drive, Naomi's car pulled into the driveway of a modest single-story house on the outskirts of town. The house belonged to Michael Carter, the head chef at a well-known local restaurant. James recognized the name and the man. Michael had attended a few church events in the past, but James had never paid him much attention. Now, as he watched Naomi exit her car and walk briskly to Michael's front door, his heart sank. She knocked, and within moments, Michael appeared, welcoming her inside. James parked a few houses away, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he struggled to process what he had just witnessed. The idea that Naomi might be having an affair struck him like a physical blow. He had always trusted her implicitly, believing their bond was unbreakable. Now, that trust felt fragile, shattered by the image of his wife entering another man's home. He remained in his car for nearly an hour, watching as the house remained lit but silent. No one entered or exited. The stillness of the scene only fueled his imagination, each passing minute adding weight to his suspicions. By the time Naomi emerged, her expression unreadable, James felt as though a chasm had opened between them. He followed her home, his mind a storm of emotions, but when they returned, he said nothing. He didn't confront her or question her. Instead, he retreated to his study, seeking solace in prayer and scripture. Over the next few weeks, James's observations confirmed that Naomi's visits to Michael's home were not a one-time occurrence. On multiple occasions, she repeated the same pattern, leaving the house with vague explanations and returning hours later. Each time, James discreetly followed her, witnessing the same sequence of events, Naomi entering Michael's home, staying for hours, and leaving without any obvious signs of distress or urgency. James's internal conflict grew with each visit. On one hand, he was consumed by anger and heartbreak, unable to reconcile Naomi's actions with the woman he had loved for so many years. On the other hand, he clung to his faith, telling himself that God's will would ultimately reveal the truth. He convinced himself to remain patient, to avoid confrontation, and to trust in divine guidance. Despite his attempts at restraint, the situation began to take a toll on James. His sermons, once filled with passion and conviction, became subdued. Members of his congregation noticed the change in his demeanor, though no one dared to question him directly. At home, his interactions with Naomi became strained, marked by an unspoken tension that neither addressed. Naomi, seemingly oblivious to James's surveillance, continued her routine, her behavior unchanged. The lack of answers only deepened James's despair. He found himself poring over every detail of Naomi's actions, searching for clues that might explain her behavior. He reviewed bank statements again, noting withdrawals that coincided with her visits to Michael's home. He analyzed her phone records, looking for any communication that might provide insight. Yet, no matter how much he searched, he found nothing concrete to confirm his fears. James's once unshakable faith now felt tested in ways he had never imagined. He prayed incessantly, asking for wisdom and strength, but his doubts persisted. He felt isolated, burdened by a secret he couldn't share, even with those closest to him. For the first time in his life, James felt truly lost, unable to discern the path forward. Though he tried to convince himself that time would bring clarity, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing day. The image of Naomi walking into another man's home haunted him, a constant reminder of the questions that remained unanswered. James's resolve to remain patient began to waver, setting the stage for decisions that would irreversibly alter the course of their lives. The tension within James Whitaker reached a critical level as the days turned into weeks. His emotions, once tempered by faith and discipline, now festered like an untreated wound. His prayers, once a source of solace and guidance, felt hollow and ineffective. Each unanswered question about Naomi's behavior eroded the foundation of trust and stability he had worked so hard to maintain. James, a man who had faced the chaos of war with unwavering resolve, now found himself consumed by doubt and despair in the sanctity of his own home. One evening, James sat alone in his study, reviewing their bank statements for the third time that week. His eyes scanned the numbers, his frustration mounting with each unexplained withdrawal. The amounts were staggering, far exceeding what Naomi might have spent on casual expenses. The latest transaction, recorded just days earlier, was the largest yet. Its timing coincided with yet another of her visits to Michael Carter's home. This confirmation shattered what remained of James's composure. The anger he had suppressed for weeks boiled over, overtaking his usual calm demeanor. For James, the betrayal felt personal and absolute. His mind, clouded by resentment and heartbreak, could no longer entertain alternative explanations for Naomi's actions. He interpreted her secrecy and the financial discrepancies as incontrovertible proof of infidelity. Every argument they had, every unexplained absence, and every lie, real or perceived, now seemed part of a calculated deception. James's sense of control, so deeply ingrained from his years as a Marine, slipped away entirely. In the grip of his emotional turmoil, James began to devise a plan. His military training, which had once been a tool for protecting lives, became a means of channeling his anger. He decided to build a small explosive device, a task he knew he could accomplish with precision. The idea seemed to him both justified and inevitable, a way to restore order to the chaos he believed Naomi had introduced into their lives. The home she visited became his target, a symbol of her betrayal and the source of his pain. James's preparation was methodical, a reflection of his years of experience in the Marines. He gathered materials over several days, ensuring that each component was carefully selected and inconspicuous. He worked late at night in the garage, his actions hidden from Naomi and Grace. His hands, steady and deliberate, assembled the device with the precision of a craftsman. Every wire, circuit, and mechanism was double-checked, his focus unwavering. The act of building the device became an outlet for the emotions he could no longer contain. As the device neared completion, James began to plan its deployment. He monitored Naomi's schedule, noting the days and times she typically visited Michael's home. His observations revealed a pattern, and he chose a day he believed would ensure her presence. His goal was to detonate the device shortly after her arrival, an act he saw as both retribution and a way to end the torment he had endured. James's meticulous planning extended to covering his tracks. He ensured that his activities in the garage left no obvious evidence and that his behavior at home remained unchanged. To the outside world, he appeared as the same devoted pastor and family man. He continued delivering sermons, visiting parishioners, and performing his duties at church, though his heart was heavy with the burden of his intentions. As the chosen day approached, James's resolve hardened. He interpreted his actions as a necessary response to what he perceived as a moral failing on Naomi's part. His mind, consumed by righteous indignation, allowed no room for doubt or second thoughts. Each step of his plan felt inevitable, the culmination of weeks of anguish and betrayal. On the morning of the planned detonation, James spent time with Grace, ensuring she was safely at school and unaware of the storm brewing in their lives. He then prepared the device, carefully transporting it to the vicinity of Michael's home. He positioned it discreetly, ensuring that it would not be noticed until it was too late. His actions were calculated and deliberate, driven by a singular focus on his perceived need for justice. As James waited for the moment to act, his mind returned to his faith, though not in the way it once had. He convinced himself that his actions were aligned with God's will, a punishment for the sins he believed Naomi had committed. His prayers were no longer for guidance or forgiveness, but for the strength to carry out his plan. When the time came, James pressed the detonator, unleashing the explosion that would irrevocably change the lives of everyone involved. In that moment, his anger and pain found their outlet, though the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The day of the explosion began like any other in the quiet suburbs of Asheville, North Carolina. The neighborhood, characterized by its tree-lined streets and modest homes, exuded a sense of calm. By early evening, the fading sunlight cast long shadows, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. At first glance, it was an ordinary Tuesday, with families settling in for dinner and children playing in the yards. At approximately 6:47 p.m., Naomi Whitaker arrived at Michael Carter's residence. She parked her car across the street, stepping out with a small bag in hand. Her movements were deliberate but unhurried as she approached the front door. Unbeknownst to her, James's explosive device was hidden near the base of the house, rigged to detonate shortly after her arrival. James, sitting in his own vehicle parked several blocks away, watched from a distance, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and dread. At 6:51 p.m., the explosion erupted, shattering the evening's tranquility. The blast tore through the small house, sending debris flying in all directions. The shockwave was felt for blocks, rattling windows and triggering car alarms. Flames quickly engulfed the structure, their orange glow illuminating the darkening sky. The sound of the explosion echoed through the neighborhood, followed by the wailing of sirens as emergency services rushed to the scene. Naomi was caught just feet from the house when the explosion occurred. The force of the blast threw her backward, but a parked car absorbed much of the impact, shielding her from the worst of the debris. She landed hard on the pavement, her body battered and bleeding, but she was conscious. The bag she had been carrying lay torn beside her, its contents scattered amidst the rubble. Inside the house, Michael Carter and his brother, Daniel, bore the brunt of the explosion. Michael, who had been preparing tea in the kitchen, suffered severe burns and multiple fractures. Daniel, seated in the adjacent living room, was critically injured by falling debris and shrapnel from the explosion. Both men were trapped beneath the wreckage as flames began to consume the structure. Neighbors poured out of their homes, some shouting in panic, others attempting to assist. Several individuals pulled Naomi to safety, noting her dazed state and visible injuries. Others tried to approach the house, but the intense heat and spreading flames forced them back. Firefighters arrived within minutes, battling the blaze and searching for survivors. James, still parked a short distance away, watched the chaos unfold through the windshield of his car. The sight of the burning house and the injured people being carried from the scene filled him with an overwhelming sense of guilt and horror. The anger that had driven him to this point dissipated, replaced by the stark reality of what he had done. He realized the gravity of his actions and the lives he had irrevocably altered. By 8:15 p.m., the fire was under control, and first responders had extracted Michael and Daniel from the wreckage. Both men were alive but in critical condition. Naomi was transported to a nearby hospital, her injuries deemed non-life-threatening but requiring immediate medical attention. As the emergency responders worked, James drove to the nearest police station. He walked inside, his face pale and his demeanor subdued. He identified himself and confessed to the bombing, detailing his motivations and the steps he had taken to carry out the act. His voice was steady but filled with remorse as he recounted the events leading to his decision. The news of James's confession spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. The congregation at Harmony Baptist, who had long revered James as a disciplined and devout leader, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the actions he had taken. Neighbors, friends, and church members gathered outside the Whitaker home, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. The aftermath of the explosion left a scar on the neighborhood, both physical and emotional. The charred remains of Michael's house served as a grim reminder of the violence that had shattered their peaceful community. For James, the weight of his actions and the lives he had harmed marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by repentance and the consequences of his choices. In the aftermath of the explosion and James Whitaker's confession, law enforcement delved deeply into the circumstances surrounding Naomi's visits to Michael Carter's home. What initially appeared to be evidence of an affair unraveled into a far more complex and tragic story. As investigators sifted through Michael's property, they uncovered numerous medical records, herbal remedies, and specialized equipment not commonly found in a residential setting. Inquiries into Michael's background revealed that while he was a celebrated chef, his brother, Daniel Carter, held a less publicized profession. Daniel was a practitioner of Eastern medicine, trained in acupuncture and herbal therapy. He had moved in with Michael years prior, quietly operating a private practice out of the house. His clients often came by word of mouth, seeking alternatives to conventional treatments. Naomi Whitaker had been one such client. A closer examination of her medical history revealed that she had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer months earlier. The discovery was made during a routine checkup, but Naomi had chosen to keep the diagnosis a secret, even from James. Investigators learned that her decision stemmed from deeply personal reasons rooted in past trauma. Years earlier, Naomi's mother had suffered a prolonged illness that ended tragically due to medical mismanagement. The doctors had misdiagnosed her condition, leading to ineffective treatments and avoidable complications. Naomi had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of this negligence, leaving her distrustful of conventional medicine. When she received her own diagnosis, she resolved to avoid the path her mother had taken. Her search for alternatives led her to Daniel Carter. Recommended by a mutual acquaintance, Daniel had gained a reputation for successfully treating clients with chronic and terminal illnesses through non-traditional methods. Naomi began visiting the Carter home regularly, undergoing acupuncture sessions and receiving specialized herbal supplements imported from Asia. The financial withdrawals that James had found so suspicious were used to cover the costs of these treatments. Daniel's services, while discreet and effective for many, were not cheap. Naomi also paid for private lab tests and diagnostics, preferring to keep her medical records outside the traditional healthcare system. She went to great lengths to conceal her condition, hiding herbal remedies in innocuous containers and consuming specially prepared teas when James wasn't around. Naomi's secrecy was not born of betrayal but of fear. She knew James's views on alternative medicine were skeptical, shaped by his disciplined and pragmatic nature. She worried that he would insist on traditional treatment paths, ones that she felt would strip her of agency and dignity. More than anything, she didn't want to burden him with the knowledge of her illness, knowing how deeply he had been affected by her mother's death years earlier. Her choice to keep her illness a secret was both an act of self-preservation and a misguided attempt to protect her family. She believed that by quietly pursuing alternative treatments, she could shield James and Grace from the emotional toll of her condition. Each visit to Michael and Daniel's home was a step in what she hoped would be her path to recovery, a chance to regain her strength without disrupting the delicate balance of their lives. As this information came to light, it painted a starkly different picture of Naomi's actions. The visits that James had interpreted as evidence of infidelity were, in fact, desperate attempts to preserve her health and keep her family whole. The money she had withdrawn was not a sign of deceit but a necessary expense in her fight for survival. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Whitaker family and the community. James, already consumed by guilt for his actions, was devastated by the truth. His assumptions, fueled by suspicion and miscommunication, had led to a tragic series of events that could never be undone. Naomi, recovering from her injuries in the hospital, was left to grapple with the unintended consequences of her secrecy. The investigation into the explosion concluded with a clearer understanding of the motivations behind everyone's actions. The truth, while exonerating Naomi of the suspicions James had harbored, cast a shadow over their marriage and their future. The hidden truth had finally come to light, but at a cost neither of them could have anticipated. The days following James Whitaker's confession were marked by a profound silence between him and Naomi. From her hospital bed, Naomi wrestled with the physical pain of her injuries and the emotional devastation of her husband's actions. Though her body bore the marks of the explosion, it was the unraveling of her marriage and the betrayal of trust that weighed heaviest on her. Despite this, Naomi chose to visit James in prison, seeking closure and the chance to confront the man who had nearly ended her life. The prison's sterile environment stood in stark contrast to the warmth of their once shared home. James, now a shadow of the man he had been, sat quietly as Naomi arrived. She spoke slowly, recounting the truth of her illness and her reasons for keeping it hidden. Her words were measured but filled with emotion as she explained her fears, her mistrust of conventional medicine, and her belief that secrecy was the best way to protect their family. She acknowledged her role in the breakdown of their communication, though it didn't absolve James of his actions. James listened intently, his face etched with regret. The weight of his assumptions and the irrevocable consequences of his choices were unbearable. He broke down, confessing his remorse and apologizing not only for his actions but for failing to trust her and for allowing his doubts to consume him. Naomi, though deeply wounded, forgave him. Her faith, though tested, remained unshaken, and she believed in the power of redemption. From that moment on, James dedicated himself to seeking forgiveness and atonement. In prison, he began writing letters to Naomi and their daughter, Grace. These letters were filled with heartfelt apologies, reflections on his faith, and the lessons he had learned from his mistakes. He wrote about the dangers of mistrust, the importance of open communication, and the devastating impact of unchecked assumptions. Naomi, while recovering physically, faced new challenges as her cancer progressed. Despite continued treatments under Daniel Carter's care, the disease advanced aggressively. Naomi eventually turned to traditional medicine, but the late-stage diagnosis limited her options. Over the next 2 years, she fought bravely, balancing her role as a mother with her own health struggles. Michael and Daniel Carter, who had narrowly survived the explosion, decided to leave Asheville. The notoriety brought by the tragedy made it impossible for them to maintain their private lives or Daniel's practice. They relocated to another state, where Daniel continued his work discreetly. Their departure left behind unanswered questions and a community grappling with the fallout of James's actions. As Naomi's health declined, she prepared Grace for the inevitable. She shared stories of her life with James, emphasizing the love and devotion that had once defined their marriage. She encouraged Grace to forgive her father, not for his sake but for her own peace. Naomi passed away quietly in her sleep, surrounded by Grace and a few close friends. Her death marked the end of her personal struggle but left Grace to navigate life without both parents. James, upon hearing of Naomi's passing, was inconsolable. He turned to his faith, seeking solace in prayer and the belief that Naomi's soul was at peace. He continued to write to Grace, offering guidance, love, and wisdom from the confines of his cell. His letters became a lifeline for her, providing strength as she grieved and built a life of her own. Grace, now an adult, found purpose in her mother's legacy. Inspired by the lessons of her family's tragedy, she became a counselor, specializing in helping families navigate illness, loss, and miscommunication. She believed that understanding and forgiveness were the keys to healing, values instilled in her through Naomi's teachings and James's letters. James remained in prison for the remainder of his sentence, dedicating his time to mentoring other inmates and sharing his story. He led prayer groups and offered spiritual guidance, using his experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and the consequences of mistrust. Though he carried the burden of his actions, he found purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. Grace, in her work, often quoted passages from her father's letters. They reminded her that even in the darkest moments, redemption was possible, and that love, though flawed, could endure. The Whitaker family's story, marked by tragedy and resilience, became a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of faith.